أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل Muhammad. Welcome to Apostolic Islam, presenting the faith God revealed, the prophets preached, and the Muslims kept. In this video, we will be responding to the failed attempt of an Eastern so-called Orthodox apologist who tried refuting our last video on the Gospel of Luke and whether it teaches if Jesus is God. Unlike Paul in Acts chapter 20 verse 9, we won't make you die from slumber, so make sure you watch it till the end for the complete refutation. Before we begin, I'd like to make something clear. Our opponent tried to distract the viewers from our biblical refutation of his poor attempt to prove that Jesus is God in the Gospel of Luke. He does so by constantly appealing to his unsubstantiated and baseless concepts, which he assumes to be axioms of the Bible, while accusing us of projecting Islamic concepts into the Bible. As we respond to the poor objections he raised, it will be made clear to those watching how he's trying to deceive. Let's begin. In his first objection, he says, quote, "It is a fallacy to assume that divine action has to be understood in a univocal way, i.e., that its expression through prophets can only be instrumental. That is an Islamic projection onto the biblical understanding of prophet. Let's address this. This Trinitarian worshipper of his three gods, in an attempt to refute us, already begins with a straw man. That we allegedly claimed miracles and other divine works are only done through one logical possibility, that being agency, meaning that the miracles done by the prophets are not actually theirs, because in reality, it is God doing it through them, i.e., he is using them as instruments while they themselves have no causal power. In other words, God being the cause and the source of the miracle. The prophet, in this case being Jesus, through whom the miracle is expressed, is merely an agent, which negates Jesus of having causal power or doing them independent of God. Note that nowhere was this alleged claim made by us. We did not assert the logical impossibility of God giving causal miraculous powers to his creation, which includes Jesus in this particular case. Rather, we backed up with evidence that the miracles were done by God through Jesus as an agent. We are merely going by the standard of the Bible itself. It seems like we made our pagan opponent uncomfortable with the explicit statement of Peter, who in his first sermon after the ascension of Jesus, while addressing the crowds, says that it was God who did miracles, wonders, and signs through Jesus. It gets worse for our opponent. Peter, after saying that it was God who did the miracles through Jesus, says afterwards, "as you yourselves know." Notice how he's saying he expects them to know. Know what? That Jesus as the God-man was doing miracles independent of God with his own causal power? Of course not. Rather, as an approved man of God, meaning as a prophet, God was working through him. Also, bearing in mind, this is the same Luke who supposedly authored both the Gospel of Luke and Acts who is relating this from Peter. I'm sure he knew better than our opponent what Peter meant, who's in agreement with us. There is a very good reason why our desperate opponent did not bring any proof from the Bible for his invented mythical conception of prophethood that he's appealing to, which explains why he ignored this statement of Peter and instead cries about us projecting Islamic concepts onto the Bible. Well, seems like he hasn't read much on Palamas, as his first argument is already lacking energy. Let's examine his second objection. He says, quote, "It is a fallacy to assume that Christ is the same type of prophet as other prior prophets. This again is an Islamic projection, which does not understand the fundamental role of Christ. Basically, there is an imposition of the nonsensical notion of the Islamic al-Masih onto the biblical Christ." Let's address his second objection. This objection is vague. Our opponent doesn't know what to argue, and we will demonstrate and help his poor mind find the solution. Although, before we do that, as we said in the very beginning, he constantly tries to distract by appealing to his unsubstantiated concepts he assumes to be axioms of the Bible. For example, here he now asserts that we do not understand the fundamental role of Christ. But then again, fundamental role of Christ, according to whom exactly? That's just him presupposing his polytheistic doctrine of the Trinity and the schizophrenic conception of the hypostatic union of Christ as established truths in the Bible. But this is exactly what we are disputing with him, and have proven in the first video otherwise, which he couldn't adequately respond to. Another similar example is when he tries to cope by saying that we don't understand the so-called biblical Christ or the concept of Messiah, when in reality what he meant was we don't grant him his Nicene-made fictional version of Christ to be the Christ of history, let alone the Bible. Bear in mind, the Jews also reject their so-called biblical conception of the Messiah as a polytheistic understanding of the Messiah. Again, he complains we are projecting, yet he himself does that while unable to address our argument. Now let's actually address his second objection. We reply first by saying that the prophetic office is a spiritual position, to which a chosen man is assigned by God for certain tasks and obligations. It is not an indicator, at all, of one being ontologically different to other humans or having divinity. For example, if Prophet X is higher or superior to Prophet Z, they still equally remain human beings. And as a note to that, they consider John the Baptist to be the greatest of the prophets, yet he is not different to Moses in nature. So the question is, what does it mean to be a quote, type of different prophet to others? End quote. The answer to that is simple. Being of a different type means having a different role, having different tasks and obligations under different circumstances. Just as all the prophets in nature are the same, yet Moses is a different type of prophet compared to others, and that is precisely due to his roles and tasks. And likewise, Jesus is a different type of prophet due to his roles and tasks, while both him and Moses are essentially the same, i.e., human beings. As for the mythical fallacy we apparently committed, it's not us who put Jesus among the other prophets, but Jesus himself. Let's read Matthew chapter 13, verse 57. Quote, "And they took offense at him, but Jesus said to them, 'Prophets are not without honor except in their own country and in their own house.'" End quote. Here, Christ himself groups himself among the other prophets and even gives an example of how they can all relate. It seems like our opponent has now made Jesus commit the same supposed fallacy we committed. I guess we as Muslims are in good company, and our opponent just admitted that we are the true followers of Jesus. We will wrap up this poor objection by pointing out that it is ridiculous how they complain that we say Jesus is like other prophets while they teach that Christ is a prophet like Moses, who himself is like the other prophets in nature. We seal our reply to his second objection by asking a simple question. If Peter supposedly believed, like our opponent does, that Jesus was a different type of prophet, in the sense that he was a divine prophet with his own causal powers, then why does Peter ascribe the causal power to God strictly, therefore agreeing with us and not our Trinitarian opponent? If our Trinitarian opponent responds that Peter did agree with him and not us, then we ask, where? If our opponent brings up a verse where Jesus is doing something miraculous, then we refer back to Peter, where he agrees with us in Acts chapter 2, verse 22, and repeat the first question ad infinitum. Let's deal with his third objection. He tries to argue that the Greek construction in the verse from Luke, where Jesus heals the man and tells him to go declare what God has done for him, has allusions to the Greek in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Then he claims that the New Testament writers always wrote with the Old Testament in mind and very frequently used constructions that those familiar with the Old Testament would be able to recognize and pick up on. He tries then to give another example from John chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 1, with his conclusion being that Luke is showing a complementary meaning in that the power that Jesus used to heal is the same divine power used to create, meaning that he has power over his creation, in this case, demons. So let's unpack his heinous interpretations, which could only be drawn from someone who enjoys looking at women more than looking at his Bible, or perhaps the pagan icons. Let's address the Greek construction in Luke alluding to Genesis. We ask, where does he derive the idea that they always wrote with the Old Testament in mind? Because some constructions of the text bearing similarity is by no means evidence for the author necessarily having intended to make an allusion. It's just the nature of writing. It could seemingly give the impression that the author is intending to make an allusion when he's not. After all, if the author genuinely intends to allude, he does so by directly quoting verbatim, or by giving a more certain reference to the Old Testament, such as Matthew from Hosea, or Luke from Daniel. We also respond that contextually it makes no sense. What does God creating the heavens and the earth, shaping and forming the planets, have anything to do with the prophet healing a man? Our opponent seems to be relying heavily on his esoteric interpretation as a definitive proof text. As for his mention of John and Genesis, it's just to distract, because he's realized that it's impossible to demonstrate from Luke the deity of Christ. So he runs to the Gospel, which he thinks gives him a better chance of proving this alleged deity of Christ. But then again, that's just him presupposing Justin Martyr's interpretation to be true, who in reality just butchered the prologue and presented a pagan's argument to reconcile his second subordinate god with the one true God. His conclusion is funny. He doesn't realize that all of his desperate attempts lead him to crumble, because even if he appeals to his esoteric interpretation, he ends up submitting to our case. Why, you may ask? Here's the answer. When he argues that Luke is trying to make an allusion to Genesis, which is that the power Jesus used to heal the man is the same power that created the world, bingo! We agree with you. This is what we've been trying to tell you. The divine power that created the heavens and the earth is the same power that Jesus used to heal the man. Yes, the same man whom Jesus told after healing to go declare what God has done. Why? Because Luke himself says in chapter 5 verse 17 that the power of God was with Jesus so he could heal the sick. Hence Jesus said, "Go declare what God did." But of course, the fallible man in excitement could only recognize the prophet in front of him, through whom God healed him, while the prophet, being God conscious, attributed the healing to God, a true humble servant of God. Oh, who else better than Peter, who himself says in Acts chapter 10 verse 38, God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and how he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, because God was with him. In summary, the esoteric interpretation is in fact a refutation of our opponent himself, and yet another proof for our case. The divine power that created the world is in fact the same power that Jesus used to heal the man. This divine power, Peter calls him God, who was with Jesus, and through him, God was healing and exorcising the demons. Simple. As for the rest of his objections, he appeals to a bunch of other verses in Luke, where it talks about the healing power in Jesus, but we've already demonstrated how his bogus interpretation of them crumbles in our replies earlier. It gets really embarrassing. He accuses us of ignoring the other verses, yet he himself never quoted them in the original video. We are simply addressing the argument that he made, that through Luke chapter 8 verses 38 to 39, if he now realizes that his original argument was not sufficient at all, which it wasn't, and wants to now try and cope by quoting extra passages and claimed we ignored the context when we didn't, then he has shown his desperation and weak arguments, pretty much hopeless on his part. Truly humiliating. He tries to come up with a new argument that isn't in the original video, and then calls us out for not responding. It doesn't get more dishonest. Not surprising from this pagan Eastern Heterodox. At the end, he tries to argue that Jesus gave authority and power to the disciples, which somehow implies that he's God. But his argument presupposes Christ possesses ontological and causal power, which he has failed to substantiate. Also, something very important to add, he utterly ignored all the passages we used from Peter that debunk and thrash his bogus interpretation. It's because he knows there is no refutation of Peter on this, unless he wants to call Peter a Muslim. Clearly, the weight he gives to his body has outscaled the weight he gives to the Bible with such a horrible argument. Moving forward, he strawmans the Muslims. We don't reject that prophets can extend their power and authority given to them by God. The Messenger of God, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, himself directly gave divine authority to some of his companions on certain occasions. This is because the source of itself ultimately is God. We conclusively reply that Jesus in the Gospel says that those who receive, welcome, and accept the disciples will receive him, and those who receive him will receive God, which explicitly establishes that the ultimate authority is God, who grants to Christ, who extends to the disciples. The only way to refute us is to prove that Christ possesses independent and ontological causal power, something our opponent couldn't prove. We will wrap this up with some verses. John chapter 5 verse 19 mentions that the Son can do nothing by himself. John chapter 17 verse 24, Christ's glory was given to him. Jesus was given authority because the power which Christ possessed was, as he affirmed, was given to him. As is mentioned in Matthew chapter 28 verse 18, all power is given unto me. He positively denies himself to be the author of miraculous works, but refers him to the Father. In John chapter 14 verse 10, the Father dwells in me, he does the works. And also in Matthew chapter 12 verse 28, if I cast out devils, it is by the Spirit of God. Because he distinctly states that these works bear witness not to his own power, but the Father had sent him. In John chapter 5 verse 36. Because he positively denies that he is possessed of the divine attribute of omnipotence. John chapter 5 verse 30. I can of my own self do nothing. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.